It is April 16th, 2026, and we are going to be covering a couple different stories today. And the first one is about the possibility of Donald Trump replacing Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. And this is from CNN. President Trump seems to be leaning in on the idea that elderly conservative Justices Alito and Thomas might think about a conveniently timed retirement this year. Trump, in comments made to Fox News, pointed out, quote, "I think he is one of the great justices of all times," referring to Samuel Alito. "It'd be nice to say now I have somebody for 40 years. Trump said he already had a short list of possible replacements. He seemed to point to the late liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a cautionary tale. And if you remember, she was close to retirement age. She didn't retire. And when she passed away, Donald Trump was in office, and he was able to fill her seat on the Supreme Court. So she definitely hurt the Democrat Party in making the decision not to step down and retire. He twice alluded to how justices can preserve their ideology on the court for decades to come by allowing a like-minded replacement. And when you consider the record of Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito in their tenure on the Supreme Court, and the new justices that Trump has appointed, like, for example, Amy Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh, they have very different ways of rendering judgments with various cases than each other. They're Republicans, they're conservatives, but they still have a different way of rendering judgments in the cases. So I don't know that Trump would be able to find a like-minded justice like Clarence Thomas or Samuel Alito. So it goes on. This is one of the biggest political questions of 2026 for a couple reasons. First thing to note is that Alito and Thomas retiring would be very much in keeping with how things work on the Supreme Court. The last 7 justices to retire have done so when the party was more aligned with those who controlled the presidency and the Senate. In this way, they would be able to confirm, the Senate would be able to confirm like-minded justices, obviously. Alito and Thomas are close to the normal retirement age. The last 10 justices retired at 80 years old. Both could stick it out, but if Republicans lose the Senate in November, the justices could be well into their 80s before the GOP holds the White House and the Senate again. And who knows when that would be. If the Republicans happen to lose in 28 and they lose in the midterms, the House and the Senate, who knows when they'll be able to regain both houses of Congress and the presidency. Given the record so far of what Trump is doing, that is something to be concerned about. And there will also likely be significant political pressures to avoid the situation, like we just mentioned, that Ginsburg put Democrats in, whether it comes from Trump or other Republicans. The political risk for Trump is great because it's looking increasingly like Democrats will make significant gains in the 2026 election, at least in the House. And they go on to point out that it'll be harder for Democrats to flip the Senate since it involves winning some red states that Trump won by double digits. But can't be ruled out. And what's more, even if Senate Democrats come up short in November, there could be a big difference between Trump nominating a justice with 53 Republican votes this year and trying to do so with 50 or 51 in the second half of his term. If he has less Republicans in the Senate, it could be much more difficult. And you have to consider what the political economy would look like a year from now. If we have a continuation of the Iran war, if the economy gets worse, there are a lot of Republicans that may actually break from Trump, whereas previously, like this year and last year, they would have been staunch allies of whatever he was trying to push forward. So, as I've mentioned before, as his presidency goes on and we see a continuation of some of these initiatives that he's putting in place, it's going to be a lot easier in the long run for Republicans to distance themselves from Trump or Trump's favor. So he's not going to probably be able to rely on the Senate, as they're pointing out here, especially if they just lose a couple of seats, but retain their majority. So given Trump's recent disenchantment with 2 of his appointees who ruled against him on the tariffs case, Barrett and Gorsuch, he would likely prefer to have some cushion to choose someone he might view as more loyal. And loyalty really, it matters to him, but it's about, loyalty is one thing, but what's more important is, are they taking a proper perspective on the Constitution? Are they conservative justices that align with people like Alito and Thomas? And honestly, I don't know why he wouldn't make the same mistake that he did with Gorsuch and Barrett. And they're not even totally that bad. The only reason that he doesn't like them is because they rule against him in certain things that he, that he's putting forward. But they're not even all that bad. But again, if he has an opportunity to pick justices again, I don't know that I don't trust his judgment. And it's likely that he could wind up with somebody just like Barrett or Gorsuch. So, but the president may have other options or reasons apart from the confirmability factor to try and usher things in this direction. First, a confirmation fight could provide a sorely needed turnout boost for a GOP base that is significantly less enthusiastic about the midterms than Democrats are. And turnout is not going to just be contingent if this Supreme Court conversation comes up. The big elephant in the room is the war and the direction the war is going to go in and the economy. Those are going to be the two things that are going to drive voter turnout. There's nothing more that's going to turn out voters right now than if this war continues, if it gets worse and escalates the way that Pete Hegseth is intimating that it might. These are the things that are going to determine whether people come out to vote. Not sure that even if Alito and Thomas were to step down, if Trump was about to nominate replacements for them, would that really get the base excited as much as maybe just bringing down the gas prices? So a bigger part of this is Trump's legacy. Replacing Alito, Thomas, or both with younger justices would not change the court's 6-3 conservative majority, but it would likely help cement it for much longer. Such a change would give Trump an even more significant imprint on the court, appointing either 4 out of 9 justices or 5 out of 9 justices between his first and second terms. At the end of that section of the Fox Business interview, the host wanted to switch topics, but Trump cut in to make one last point, suggesting maybe he could be dealing with more than just Alito and Thomas retiring, which I doubt. He said, quote, "In theory, it's 2 or 3, they tell me. If you read statistics, it could be 2, could be 3, could be 1. I don't know." But he said he's prepared to do it. So this is a tough call. Like I said, given the ideological leanings of the justices that he's already confirmed, that he's already gotten confirmed, they're more centrist than Alito and Thomas. And who's to say that he won't, again, as I just mentioned, do the same thing. So it'll be hard to find candidates that meet the stature of Clarence Thomas. So moving on, there are in the rumor mill, not even the rumor mill, it's been reported, this is from USA Today, that the Pentagon is ramping up planning for possible military operations in Cuba. Now, this is unlikely. I'm sure they're talking about it. They've been talking about it for the past, 5 months now. After Venezuela, the hubris that the administration has because of Venezuela, they've been wanting to go after Cuba, obviously. There's been the cutoff of energy resources into Cuba. They don't have oil and energy going in. Their infrastructure is depleted. In fact, just about a couple weeks ago, there was some kind of agreement, I guess, that Russia would be allowed to deliver oil and energy supplies and medical equipment to Cuba. So it's pretty bad already now because they've again been cut off from everything. And so, according to USA Today, military planning for a possible Pentagon-led operation in Cuba is quietly ramping up in case Trump gives an order to intervene there. And what would be the cause for us doing that? In Venezuela, it was narco trafficking and the communist Chinese building infrastructure and inroads into Venezuela. In Iran, there are any given number of reasons that we've went over why we're using military action over there. They're all nonsensical. But you wouldn't have this with Cuba, honestly. So that's why I don't think that a military operation is necessarily at the top of the priority list right now. But Two sources familiar with the order spoke to USA Today on condition of anonymity. The directives appear to be an escalation of recent tensions between the US and Cuba. It began in January when the Trump administration curbed oil shipments to Cuba as part of a broader campaign to force sweeping political changes of the communist-run island. In a statement to USA Today, the Pentagon said it plans for a range of contingencies and remains prepared to execute the president's orders as directed. I would posit that perhaps they're looking at paying people off right now, similar to what they did in Venezuela before they picked up Maduro and his wife. So looking at their security apparatus and people who they could bribe there, people potentially within the government. So, and then of course you have, we're kind of bogged down obviously with Iran, so you can't focus on this. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but I don't agree with what he's doing with Cuba or what he wants to do with Cuba. Depending, again, on which component you're talking about. We can get into more of that later. But it seems that this would have made more sense than Iran. It's in our sphere of influence. And I don't think military action is necessary in either one of these countries just because you don't like their governments. But the priority maybe should have been our own hemisphere before getting bogged down in the Middle East again. And then you tack on Greenland, and going into midterms, Trump would have been at least able to tout, well, we resolved Venezuela. Cuba is now, we can put that badge on us as well of success. And the additional basing rights that we have in Greenland, it seems from a foreign policy perspective, that's something that you could easily sell to the American people rather than this whatever the hell is going on in Iran, whatever they're trying to sell in Iran to the American people, which just really isn't working. It's making his presidency more unpopular than ever. But again, this would have been a suite of successes that he could have taken, foreign policy successes he could have carried into the midterms, and he didn't. In the economy would have still been stable. Could have had some issues there, but it wouldn't be what we're seeing, right now. But I digress. The United States and Cuba acknowledge they're in the early stages of trying to find out ways out of the crisis. But it's not clear how much each side is willing to compromise. And again, what are we compromising on? Again, this is another regime change operation, to make it simply so, you're just basically wanting to, again, give an ultimatum and force the regime to step down. And as with Venezuela, the regime will likely not step down. The infrastructure will still be there, but Castro and his family will, I'm assuming, be removed from the scene. So it's not even really, technically it's a regime change, but again, Trump wants it to be subtle and quiet. I don't even think the way he's talking about Cuba. Yeah, the bravado and everything is there, but I don't think that he honestly wants to use any military assets, not even to the extent that he did in Venezuela. So in March, USA Today reported the two countries had been in discussions to sign a possible historic economic deal that withdraw relations. And this was around early March. It was reported that the US and Cuba were negotiating an economic deal, and the details of the deal were never released. And the exact timing of when Trump would release it or Marco Rubio would release it weren't released, because he's the one that's leading the negotiations right now for Cuba. But an agreement could include a relaxation of on Americans' ability to travel to Havana. There was an earlier version of this during the Obama administration. He allowed U.S. citizens, relaxed restrictions on U.S. citizens traveling to Cuba as well. And Trump would not need Congress's approval to loosen those types of restrictions. Discussions have also included an off-ramp for President Miguel Diaz-Canel, and that's the Castro family, and he's head of the Castro family and the remaining Castro family, to leave the island. The deal would have included agreements on ports, energy, tourism, and the U.S. government has floated dropping some of the sanctions. And obviously, for someone like Trump in real estate, the casino business, and that kind of thing, he kind of wants to bring Cuba back to the degeneracy of Batista. when organized crime was basically running Havana, and you have the casinos, the hotel business. So people close to Trump would definitely make windfall profits if that were to happen. So you can imagine that these conversations are certainly happening, and they'll likely be in agreement before Trump leaves office. Many people will be in his orbit will be benefiting from that. So even as the Trump administration's attention has shifted to the war in Iran, tensions between Washington and Havana have escalated in recent weeks. Trump has suggested he expects soon to have the honor of taking Cuba in some form, adding, "Whether I free it, take it, I think I can do anything I want with it." And just to reiterate, this could have been done. And I'm not talking about whether I would agree or disagree with this right now. I'm just saying, if this was a priority of the administration, it would have been better to pursue this after Venezuela than to be playing around in what's potentially shaping up to be a quagmire in the Middle East. But as we talked about yesterday, there are some signs that things are loosening up and negotiations will continue. On April 13th, Trump told USA Today at the White House, "We may stop by Cuba after we're finished with this," when he was referring to Iran. And again, stop by for what? What's the rationale? Now, it sounds like this is all happening in back channels and behind closed doors. I doubt that he's going to go in and kidnap the rest of Castro's family, but you can't put anything past him. I believe that it's the son of Fidel or Raul that that Rubio is negotiating with. But I read this a while back, so it fell off my radar. But in a recent interview with Newsweek, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel vowed that his country would fight back if the U.S. launched a military attack, unlike the lead up to. And even if that happened, I think in a situation, I know that these probably aren't too comparable, but I think of this as maybe Syria, because when Syria fell, when Assad fell a couple of years ago, the military evaporated. There were a lot of problems, institutional issues with the military. Personnel weren't getting paid. There was a lot of corruption. It seems that given what's happened to Cuba's economy, would their military dissolve if the U.S. were to do anything kinetic? Could be a possibility. I don't know what the shape is of their military from an institutional standpoint. If the economic pitfalls and sanctions have affected the way the military functions, I don't know, but that's a question. If we did anything, perhaps there are enough people susceptible within their national security apparatus that can be bribed. So, unlike the lead up to the U.S. operations in Venezuela and Iran, U.S. officials have not been making a case for Cuba's imminent threat on the U.S. And again, giving some kind of prerequisite. He's just basically saying, we're going to take it. We're going to bleed them, which is just cruel from a humanitarian standpoint, moral standpoint. We're going to bleed their economy, bleed the people, get them frustrated enough, and then go in. But they're not trying to make a case for intervention. Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University, said he thinks the talk of prepping military plans may be more a military threat than actual strategy. And he said that right now there's a lot of signaling going on, which I believe. Should an economic deal be signed or regime change take place, we just talked about the many people in Trump's orbit that would profit off of that. And this takes us to our next story, and this is covering the U.S. Department of Defense. The Pentagon has actually been holding talks with Ford and General Motors about how these two car makers can contribute to expanding the infrastructure, the manufacturing capacity for military output. And this is something that I've been watching for quite some time. And not necessarily bringing it back, but increasing the manufacturing capacity for military hardware components is a good thing. I think trying to streamline and improve on military procurement is a good thing. And I have two stories on that here, but I think it's a good thing for American jobs and, of course, for deterrence. Now, I can't have my cake and eat it too and expect that these weapons and this manufacturing capacity won't be put to bad use like stupid wars in the Middle East. But I have studied World War II and seeing how these companies like the car makers in Detroit were able to shift from commercial to war making material in such a rapid way during the war and put so many people to work in this kind of thing. The way they were able to scale up that easily for World War II, and I'm not saying it was easy, but the rapid pace they did it, it's something that I think is important for our national security. When you look at the Russo-Ukrainian war, you see how rapidly the Russians are able to get their manufacturing into place to mass produce drones and missiles and the hardware that's needed for the soldiers on the front line. They can do that very quickly and scale up fast, and that's a capacity that I actually agree with the Pentagon and the Trump administration improving upon. So this is according to the Financial Times. The Pentagon has held talks with General Motors and Ford about how Detroit car makers can contribute to U.S. weapon supply chains as part of the Trump administration's overhaul of military procurement. Now, the timing, of course, is of no coincidence. The recent conflict in Iran exposed critical weaknesses in America's defense industrial base. Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired at 9 times the annual procurement rate. Every precision strike missile in inventory was expended. Patriot interceptors were depleted across the region. Just 6 weeks of high-intensity war overwhelmed a system built for peacetime deterrence. This is kind of what happens when the Pentagon is working with private industry. They don't want to have overcapacity because they're not going to make too much profits if you've got factories sitting there doing nothing during peacetime. Now, the wide-ranging talks covered how auto manufacturers could help to produce components or parts for a range of weapon systems, including through the deployment of advanced manufacturing techniques such as 3D printing, according to people familiar with the matter. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll last year accused leading U.S. defense companies known as primes of duping the U.S. military into relying excessively on specialized systems that are more expensive and difficult to produce than their commercial equivalents. And these are just a few lessons that the administration has picked up since the Russo-Ukrainian war started out, how easily the Russians, again, were able to scale up production and mass produce, cheap drones, missile systems, artillery, and all of this different hardware that's been used against the Ukrainians. And they do it cheaply. Even if we look at the situation in Iran and the drones that the Iranians are using to attack military bases across the Middle East and in Israel, they're very cheap. Hundreds of thousands versus $1 million missile interceptors used by Israel and the Arab countries. Millions of dollars worth of interceptors being spent. And these are very difficult to produce in mass in the quantities that are needed for the multi-front situation that we're looking at with Iran, and then still continuing to supply Ukraine and this kind of stuff. So the Pentagon is very motivated to restructure procurement, to move faster, to get things done at a lower cost, and to remove roadblocks to increase production. So they have reached out to GM and Ford, and the focus is on a preliminary basis. What can they do to help? The talks went beyond the company's existing contracts with the military and focused on how the Detroit automakers could break production and supply chain bottlenecks for existing defense contractors. And this, you think about Ford and General Motors, these aren't the only industries that are thinking about, getting involved in military procurement and trying to streamline it and improve the processes. It's also, you have, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan that has he put a piece out in the Wall Street Journal, I think last year, talking about how he's looking at ways that that his bank could contribute to this process of, again, streamlining and making military procurement more accessible. A Pentagon official told the Financial Times that the Department of War is committed to rapidly expanding the defense industrial base by leveraging all available commercial solutions and technologies to ensure warfighters maintain a decisive advantage. The department is aggressively pursuing and integrating the best of American innovation. Now, this dovetails the 1.5. This helps to make sense, a little bit more sense, of the $1.5 trillion budget request, the largest in history, with heavy emphasis on ramping up munitions and drone manufacturing within the U.S. Now, again, I'm reiterating that I'm not in principle against ensuring that the U.S. has the capacity to mass produce munitions and military hardware on, like I said, the scale of Russia. Unfortunately, the usual suspects within the military industrial complex are averse to this idea, and that's largely, again, because they don't see this kind of mass producing and reconfiguring of military procurement as profitable. So as these massive opportunities emerge, though, lawmakers are quick to spot investment potential. Checking recent capital trades data shows several members of Congress have already been positioning portfolios and companies tied to the defense surge. So they're anticipating it for sure. And this dovetails nicely with our next story. And this is a new manufacturing facility opening up in Parsons, Kansas, to produce 155 millimeter artillery shells. And obviously, these are the shells that are being used the most in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We've heard several years since 2022 conversations about shortages in these artillery shells, but this along with drones are the two staples that have made this war, that have been at the center of this war. These artillery shells and the drones and drone technology. Now, Day and Zimmerman this is a company that was founded in Philadelphia in 1901, and it began as an engineering and construction company. The company shifted much of his business in manufacturing munitions and other military equipment during World War II. In 1951, it began operation of the Lone Star Army ammunition plant near Texarkana, Texas, one of the earliest government-owned contractor operated in the U.S. Day and Zimmerman ran that plant until its closure in 2009. So this week, the U.S. Army and American ammunition firm Day and Zimmerman announced the opening of a new facility in Parsons, Kansas, and it's going to be developed dedicated to producing the 155 millimeter M795 artillery shells. The Kansas facility is a key component of the Army's comprehensive strategy to modernize and increase its capacity and produce artillery munitions. The load, assemble, and pack process is the final step to deliver 155 millimeter munitions to the warfighter, the Army explained in a news release. Once it reaches full operational capacity, the plant is expected to produce 12,155 artillery rounds per month. And we'll see if that'll happen. Now, prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, the U.S. manufactured roughly 15,000 artillery shells per month. Now, according to the DoD, they've set a goal of increasing the production of 155 millimeter artillery shells to 40,000 or to 100,000 rounds per month. As of 2025, production has increased to around 40,000 per month. So it's a process that's happening very slowly. It very likely won't materialize given the many roadblocks that they're going to have with basically just producing more of these facilities. But it goes on here, the U.S. Army has invested $36 million in non-reoccurring engineering and production establishment activities to support the increased production of the ordnance. Now, here's the importance of the Parsons factory. The opening of the plant comes a year after the U.S. Army opened a new load, assemble, and pack facility in Camden, Arkansas, expanding production of the 155 millimeter artillery shells that are manufactured at the Iowa Army Ammunition Plant in Des Moines County, Iowa. In addition, General Dynamics operates a facility in Mesquite, Texas to produce the shells, the shell casings, while Scranton Army Ammunition Plant in Pennsylvania also produces these artillery shells. The work done here in Parsons is another important step in furthering a credible deterrence with the added industrial capacity to sustain combat operations over time, says the owner of the plant. So, in principle, I think this is a good thing. Brings jobs. They're manufacturing jobs. Might be at a very slow clip, but this is one area from Trump's campaign that I was paying attention to and that I continue to watch very closely, just having these capacities in-house. And I'm sure that the process is going to take a while before we can get to 100,000 shells a year. But with this initiative and with any other initiative that we're talking about trying to draw manufacturing back to the US, I always think of it in these terms. If we're doing something like that, then perhaps we should stop thinking about meddling in these foreign wars, in these actions that we're seeing overseas, even within our own hemisphere. Spending resources in the Caribbean over the months that we did last year just to remove Maduro instead of just negotiating and working through diplomatic channels. A lot of money could have been saved if we weren't doing that. You have to think about what's happening to our military hardware as it's sitting on the open seas all this time, and all the money that's going to go into the maintenance. And if we could just, again, invest in manufacturing here, producing deterrent mechanisms here, having the factories in place, having workers trained in producing this stuff, not necessarily so that we could go pick a fight with everybody in the world, but just so that we're prepared and trained and that kind of thing. This is what the Chinese are doing. This is what the Russians were doing before wartime. And now we're caught so flat-footed when it comes to how many ships we produce, submarines, all of these different things. And I do admire Trump trying to actually get that back on track. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. The military-industrial complex is a labyrinth of shit that he's going to have to go through, but some good signs in that direction, even if we don't get to the 100,000 artillery shells a year, which again, I think is pretty far-fetched. Now, what we have here is, we're going to pivot for a moment. We're going to talk about immigration. Now, this is a story that broke in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And it talks about how Trump's allies confronted him and talked to him about pushing for more work visas. These were allies tied to his private clubs, and I'm sure not solely tied to the clubs that Trump owns, but several people. We've heard murmurings of this for quite some time. In our last video, when we talked about immigration, we talked about how he was, pulling away from language related to mass deportations and mass deportations in general. He hired a dovish head of DHS to replace Kristi Noem, someone even worse, Mark Wayne Mullen, no border security experience or anything. So they're tamping down on the deportations, but mixed into this is what I would consider a much more progressive stance when it comes down to H-1Bs and retaining seasonal workers and temporary workers within the U.S. that aren't here legally. So the article says, quote, the administration authorized additional visas for guest workers after a lobbying campaign by industry leaders and a member of Congress. So again, not just members of his club, but in industry leaders. You're probably talking about, we are talking about landowners that have ties to the Department of Agriculture and this kind of thing, hospitality, the usual. President Trump was walking to a lobby in one of his golf clubs earlier this year when a group of associates with ties to his businesses approached him with a proposal to increase the number of visas for seasonal guest workers, according to people familiar with the matter. Bernd Lemke, the former manager of Mar-a-Lago, who recently retired after a 30-year stint working at Trump's properties, and Peter Petrino, a longtime Mar-a-Lago member, made the case to the president in January that the hospitality industry needed more workers ahead of the winter and spring peak tourism season. Adrian Tudor, a manager at Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, helped facilitate the conversation, the People said. The January meeting came after the administration late last year announced it planned to cut the number of seasonal worker slots known as H-2B visas to roughly 30,000 per year. Usually they are allocated 65,000 H-2B visas. Weeks after the meeting, the administration quietly reversed itself, releasing the maximum number of visas allowed under the law. I've said it 100 times about Trump and immigration. He's really no better than a Democrat. This is the bad news about Trump for today, just in case you were looking for it. The January meeting was the culmination of a fierce lobbying campaign to persuade the administration to reverse course by industry leaders and members of Congress, such as Representative Andy Harris of Maryland, a Trump ally whose district along Maryland's eastern shore relies heavily on visas to pick crabs. And this reminds me, just as an aside, of about a year ago when we were taught when the conversation about H-1B visas came up. And it was a very contentious situation earlier last year, right around the time that Trump came into office. Vivek and Elon Musk stirred up a bunch of shit because they're very much pro H-1B visas. But after a lot of the dust settled there, Trump went on a rally stage. I forget where it was. I think it was in Iowa. And he said, there are going to be a lot of people on the right wing that are going to be disappointed in me because I'm going to have to, we're going to have to do something with the temporary workers that are here, the people in hospitality, the people in the hotels and the farms and all that stuff. And that's roughly what he said, not word for word, but he already had it in his mind that he's going to have to basically kick the stomach of the nativists or immigration restrictionists. And he was saying it outright. When you have somebody, a swamp creature like Brooke Rollins, that's head of the Department of Agriculture, right next to you, that has actually more influence than your hawkish DHS and immigration enforcement personnel, that's going to be a problem. And he's always been on her side. Brooke Rollins headed up this America First, I think, Institute that wrote policy programs before Trump got back into office. He went with her institute, that organization, to help guide the direction his administration would go in, instead of going with the Heritage Foundation, the more conservative policy paper that was written. I forgot, it slips my mind what it was called. What was it? Anyways, so yeah, when you have people like that in your ear, they're open borders type Republicans. You know, there's always that, you know, they're one and the same as progressive Democrats when it comes to immigration. They may not want them here for the same reason Democrats want them here, but they want them here to, again, make private industry, the private firms flourish. So the article continues. Trump took the lobbying campaign seriously. People said he called his advisors and directed them to work to expand the allotment of additional temporary visas through the H-2B program. So that's where the priority is for Donald Trump when it comes to this. He was never planning on, and you know, it's almost like he said to himself, you know, I'll cut H-2B visas just to show goodwill to the nativist wing of my right flank. And then when industry comes after me, or when the admin comes and advises me that it's not a good idea to do this, I'll roll it back and I'll say, well, I tried. And most of his base are going to make excuses for it. And they're going to say, well, you know, it's his personnel. You know, he didn't have any choice but to increase the H-2Bs and H-1Bs. And I'm sure they'll make an excuse if he starts to do something with green cards and maybe a little bit of an amnesty type situation. There'll be excuses made by MAGA for all this stuff. And it's unfortunate. Now, to be fair, many in Trump's movement are not immigration restrictionists like I am. But, this everything that he's doing is kind of antithetical. It's contradictory. Like, I want to get immigrants out of the country, whether they commit a crime or not, even if the crime is just being here. But I also want to bring everyone back in because they got to do the work for the firms and this kind of thing. So it's self-defeating. He's like, you might as well just leave them here so they can go do the seasonal work like you want, man. Quit wasting tax dollars with DHS and creating controversy, costing lives. You know what I mean? So the visa program is used heavily by landscapers, fisheries, and vacation towns that have trouble finding enough Americans willing to do the job. And I would say obviously that's probably most of where these people work. They're not just working there though, and I'm really getting tired of them saying, "Well, they're just picking fruit." No, they're not. Okay, until you get E-verified in all throughout all the country, there are many small businesses. You can talk about like an auto place, whatever. They will try to get them into the business, one by hook or by crook. And I'm sure we all know this, but just saying. The White House said the administration allowed more H-2B visas to be made available because, through its crackdown on illegal immigration, it has taken away work authorizations for more than 1 million immigrants by terminating their temporary legal status. Petrino leads the Seasonal Employment Alliance, which advocates for securing the maximum number of H-2B visas each year. And of course, since 2016, Congress has allocated 33,000 visas for the winter and summer hiring season for a total of 66,000. Law allows the president to nearly double that number if he determines the economy could use the extra visa slots. The Trump administration announced on December 31st that it would only grant 35,000 additional visas for fiscal year 2026, far fewer than the nearly 65,000 maximum allowed by Congress. Now, I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly, but it said that it would only grant 35,000 additional visas for fiscal year 2026. So is this in conjunction with the 66,000? So are we looking at over 100,000 new H-2B visas? I wouldn't doubt it, but perhaps I'm wrong there. The administration said the move marked nearly 50% reduction in supplemental visas when compared with fiscal years 2023 and 2025. And saying again, you're saying supplemental visas. 2 weeks after the January meeting at Trump's Florida Golf Club, which hasn't been previously reported, the administration changed course, saying it would authorize an additional 64,716 H-2B visas for the fiscal year. People familiar with the decision said the lobbying campaign helped sway Trump to expand the number of H-2B visas. How easy that was, wasn't it? Throw the voter out the window. Special interests, baby. That's how it always has been. The lobbying campaign to expand the number of visas issued under the H-2B program went beyond the president. David Jersak, the president of the Grand Hotel in Mackinac Island, Michigan, said that during a state Republican dinner in September, he approached then DHS Secretary Kristi Noem about authorizing more visas through the program. Jersak said Noem helped set up a call with DHS officials to discuss the issue. This is your DHS secretary that I warned you a long time ago, years ago. Maybe not you specifically, but people close to me. I warned them that she would be a horrible choice. And you see what happened. And Mark Wayne Mullen is going to be soft just like this too, just to give you a little heads up. And that leads us to the end of the program, but except I have one more piece that I want to talk about, and it ties in with the immigration conversation. Now, this is an act that was put out by that they are trying to push through Congress right now. A few representatives will get them named in a moment. It's called the Dignidad Act, and this is essentially an immigration act that includes what we can call a massive amnesty. Now, I'm bringing this up not because it has the likelihood of passing through Congress. The The groups within the House of Representatives that would have to clear this bill are skeptical that it could pass. It would face so many hurdles just because it's written in such a way that it's kind of like there are a lot of poison pills in it. Basically, it's kind of a rage bait bill. But as I go through this, understand that I'm going through it just to point out that there are certain things in here that I don't think would be unacceptable to Trump, right? Because we already know that public opinion he really doesn't care about. But if there are special interests that are okay with some of these agenda items in this bill, should it even get that far, certain special interests get in his ear, just like they did with this H-2B situation. And he may actually agree to some kind of small-scale amnesty. And, you know, honestly, it may not be called an amnesty when he does it. Just like the war in Iran is not a war, he may not call it an amnesty. And I think that MAGA would actually endorse something like this and say, hey, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, we're right. Again, I think we already are at that place. We're back with Bush 1 and Bush 2. We're with a basic Republican in office. I think that's pretty obvious. But anyways, let's run through this quickly. This was an act originally introduced in July of 2025. The dignity, and this is a long one. The dignity for immigrants while guarding our nation to ignite and deliver the American Dream Act of 2025, or HR 4393. Now, that's a lot of shit, but it is a bipartisan immigration reform bill that continues to gain co-sponsors in the House of Representatives. It was introduced by Representative Maria Salazar, Republican of Florida, you know, a Cuban American who has championed border security alongside a process that the co-sponsor views as a more humane approach to undocumented immigrants already living in the United States. She introduced the bill, and Representative Veronica Escobar, a Democrat of Texas, a congresswoman representing a border district who has long advocated for immigrant rights and comprehensive reform. So these are the two individuals that introduced this act. Their collaboration reflects the bill's core premise that border security and their perspective of more humanitarian solutions are not mutually exclusive. The bipartisan proposal currently has 39 co-sponsors, 20 Democrats and 19 Republicans. I think it's more now. It's been updated, so a lot more people have actually jumped on the bandwagon with this than was initially thought, and aims to address some of the most pressing concerns impacting the immigration landscape. Now, here are the places where the Republicans and Democrats agree. What makes the Dignidad Act notable is its ability to attract support from both Democrats and Republicans. The Republican priorities are reflected in the bill, and that is an investment in physical barriers, technology, surveillance technology, and border patrol resources, mandatory e-verify, no pathway to citizenship through the Dignity program, preserving the primacy of legal immigration channels. And this is kind of, in a way, contradicted later. I'll get into that. Restitution payments from program participants. And then we have Democratic priorities, a realistic human-focused experience pathway to legal status for millions of long-term undocumented residents avoiding mass deportations, completely undermining Trump's initiative. He's undermined it himself. But DREAM Act protections for childhood arrivals, a cause Democrats have championed for decades, border processing campuses with legal counsel, medical care, etc., family utility protection, unity protections, investment in workforce development and training, and that kind of thing. Now, of course, as we just mentioned, there are significant legislative hurdles ahead. They face many challenges. The sponsors in attempting to pass this bill this year in 26. The bill has been referred to multiple House committees, and like we just mentioned, that's going to be where they face many hurdles. Additionally, you've got 2026 midterms. Now, with all 435 seats and 334 Senate seats on the ballot in November, members of Congress will want to stay away from this. It's radioactive, obviously. But none of this diminishes the significance of HR 493 as a policy framework or a statement of bipartisan intent. So You can rest assured that if nothing happens this year, depending on how, and I don't even think it depends on how the midterms go, whether it goes for the Republicans and Democrats, some form of this will likely remain in place, and be pushed bipartisanly, just to ensure that Trump isn't, in their minds, damaging the economy by removing labor and then having to pay money to allow them to come back in, which we'll get back to in a second. So here's a couple of bullet points on it. Securing America's borders. It's the Dignidad Act starts with a focus on border security, modernization of barriers and technology, border patrol, community oversight, modernizing legal immigration, backlog reduction. This is some of the keys, the controversial parts. The bill would allow long waiting beneficiaries of family and employment-based visas to obtain green cards after 10 years with premium processing options to accelerate cases. I don't know what that means. Premium processing options might have something to do with some kind of monetary situation, but this is the kind of language that is, again, this is kind of backdoor language. Is there going to be a way that they're going to be able to sort of accelerate the process by paying for it, by paying a fee, or what? STEM talent. The bill would recognize U.S. doctoral graduates in science, technology, the STEM fields, basically, and make it easier for them to obtain work visas. I don't know how difficult it is right now. It would make it easier for them to obtain work visas. I mean, that if it passed, would they waive the fee that Trump is imposing on these work visas already for people who are highly educated? Family unity and fairness. The bill would raise per country visa caps. Again, protect children from aging out of eligibility and provide new temporary family visitation visas. Sort of a way for them to sort of kind of disappear into the country. Resources for processing. The bill would allocate billions in new funding for USCIS, the Department of State, and Department of Labor to reduce backlogs and process visas more efficiently. That would take so much time and effort to untangle all the backlogs and all of this that, again, some of this stuff is just poison pills. Yeah, mandatory e-verify, asylum reform and humanitarian focused processing. This is another controversial part. This is the idea of them recognizing the humanitarian crisis at the border. Full care campuses. The bill would establish at least 3 border facilities with medical staff, legal orientation, social workers, that kind of thing. Expedited asylum determinations. The bill would streamline the asylum process, including faster, credible fear screenings and secondary reviews, while ensuring applicants have legal counsel. Streamlining the asylum process is problematic. There are many asylum seekers in the country right now that shouldn't be here, because the legitimacy of an asylum claim is just really as good as the person coming across the border says. So, I've said for a while, the asylum thing is something that needs to be X'd out completely from our immigration law. But anti-fraud measures. The bill would introduce stricter penalties for asylum fraud, require audio or video recordings of expedited removal interviews. Deferred action and work authorization. Eligible participants would receive work permits and protection from deportation for 7 years, renewable indefinitely. There's your amnesty. Restitution payments. Participants would be required to pay a total of $7,000 over the program period, directed to fund supporting American workers and workforce development. And I'm sure that in most cases there's going to be a loophole for that fee to be waived. Good standing requirements. Participants would be required to maintain employment, pay taxes, avoid public benefits, and stay out of legal trouble. And here's this weird language again. Dignity SAS would allow indefinite legal presence and work authorization, but it would not provide a special pathway to citizenship, a deliberate design choice intended to preserve fairness for people who have been waiting for a long time. So this is just ridiculous. But in closing, the point I want to make is that, it's very simple. Even if this doesn't have a chance, would he do it? Would Donald Trump in his administration given what we just learned about the special treatment he's giving to farm workers, the people who pick the fruit, which is, again, that's not the only thing that a group that H-2Bs are going to be benefiting. But given what he's been doing lately with immigration, is it far-fetched to think that he might be sold by the lobbyists on something like this? Think about it for a second. And actually provide some kind of amnesty, even if it's a minimum one, just to satiate the special interests. Is it too far-fetched to think he might do that? I don't think it is. You know, he won't call it an amnesty, though. He'll find some word to call it. He'll call it a MAGA amnesty, and, you know, you'll have many of the influencers saying that, oh, that's okay then, right? So that's our stories for today. It's kind of a collection of current events that we've went through. And if you enjoyed the video, if you made it this far, like, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think, and we'll see you next time.